What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a Pillars of Eternity lore video, specifically about the Godlike. So before we get into anything at all, let me just mention some tiny spoilers here and there for a couple of the games, more like certain companions, that type of thing. Nothing really story related per se. To kick this video off, I need to explain what a Godlike actually is. Now technically the Godlike are a race in the world of Eora, but that said they are incredibly varied compared to most others. Because what they actually are children of any race, really, that are touched in the womb by a god. Basically one of the gods of Eora imbues a little tiny bit of a divine spark into that child, and then it becomes a godlike. The godlike will then have the physical characteristics associated with the god that gave them their little bit of a spark. That spark, as I put it, actually does come up in-game, and we'll talk a little more about that and the context the game actually uses, because they call it something a little different. But suffice to say, they take on the physical characteristics of the god that gives them this power. Now, because of their physical traits being different, it's pretty easy to tell which god is associated with which type of godlike for the most part. But it does get a little more complicated than that, as we'll talk about, because in the case of Andra, she has more than one type of godlike. Now, of the 7 different types that appear in-game, we can only play as 4 of them. That said, it is worth mentioning that while we only see 7 different types in the game, the other types for the other gods are mentioned here and there. Now, the 4 playable ones are Fire, Nature, Death, and Moon. So there's the Fire Godlike, which is of course associated with the Fire God Magrin. The Nature Godlike are associated with Galawain the Hunter. The Moon Godlike are one of the 2 types associated with Andra. And the Death Godlike are of course associated with Barath, the god of death. Now, some of the other types we can see in-game, however, again, we can't play as, are an Endings Godlike. Endings Godlike are the children of Rimmergand, which is the god of entropy. Now, his Godlike appear very diseased. We see this through a potential companion in the Beast of Winter DLC, Vatner. They often are physically frail, however, just being around them can make other people sick and that kind of thing. Then there is the Marine Godlike. This is the other type that is associated with Andra. This is specifically, again, for one of the companions in Pillars of Eternity 2, Tkehu. Now, while Andra has many of her Moon Godlike, Tkehu seems to be a special case, as Tkehu is largely seen as Andra's favored godlike, if you will, throughout the second game. And because of that, and this little bit here is just purely conjecture, it kind of makes you wonder if the god associated with making someone godlike can't change the shape of said godlike's powers, so to speak. And because Andra wanted Tkehu to be different, she made him different, that kind of thing. Now, that's even more important when I get into another point a little here later in the video, but we'll circle back around to that a little bit. I just wanted to mention it here. And the other godlike we see in-game is an avian godlike. These are from the goddess Hylia, and they're often given bird-like features. Now, we have a companion that is partially avian godlike who intentionally cut herself off from the part that makes her godlike, which again we'll get into in just a minute. But my point is we do actually see that one kind of in-game, but not in its full form, so to speak. Now that we've covered what's in-game, let's talk about these people's place in the world, because they can't hide what they are. They are very physically, apparently godlike. So the second you see one of these people, you're gonna know. The Fire Godlike are basically on fire, after all. So hard to miss. Now, depending on the type of godlike and where they are born, their status in society can be vastly different. For instance, Tkehu enjoys life largely as a proverbial noble in the second game because he is a marine godlike who is considered the special son of Andra because he was born in a nation that worships Andra over all the other gods. But you compare that to, say, a death godlike, who are often seen with growths over their face that cover their eyes and stuff that they can see through. However, to the outside world, they just appear to be sinister and gross looking. Godlike like that are often killed at birth, which is a bit of a recurring theme for all of the less physically attractive, shall we say, godlike. And this might surprise you, but it's actually very common for that to happen to the nature godlike as well, because a lot of times nature godlike aren't seen as godlike. They're confused with being some sort of birth defect because they'll think it's like some sort of disease or fungus growing over the nature godlike's face or something like that. So they'll think what they're doing is a mercy. So it's less like, oh my god, this thing is terrible, and more like they think there's something wrong with it that's going to kill it anyway. Now, if that wasn't enough, now we get into the fun legal side of things in the fantasy world. This is always kind of a funny topic to talk about just because, laws in video games, especially high fantasy games like this, are always kind of interesting to talk about anyway. Almost feels a little ridiculous, but nonetheless, godlike are often treated differently in the world of Eora, in law as well. So we actually see some examples of this in the Valen republics that we can hear about. For instance, in those republics, godlike are actually legally not considered to have a gender or a sex. They're just amorphous blobs to the law, which is a problem because the Valen republics have a lot of laws around one's gender. So for someone like a godlike who legally has none, they can encounter a lot of problems there. Now, it is worth mentioning none of the godlike are able to reproduce. The same divine spark, so to speak, that gives them their appearance also renders them sterile, which is why places like the republics have that weird legal distinction for them, because this being like a weird medieval fantasy setting, the purpose of marriage in basically all of these games is to produce children. That is part of the lore of the series. So just in summation there, a godlike's place in the world can be a bane or a blessing to that person. So now let's get into that thing about the spark that I mentioned. Now in game, you can occasionally, like once or twice, hear it mentioned as like a divine spark. However, the primary way it is conveyed is as a chime, a bell of some sort. And you'll often see the sound of bells and stuff associated with any conversations with gods in game, implying that that is some sort of significant part of it. And specifically, with Pallegina's side quest in Pillars of Eternity 2, it's very distinctly mentioned as some sort of chime, because while Pallegina was an avian godlike, or still is really, she was able, through study and some procedures, was able to actually, as she put it, cut her chime so that it was no longer active in some way, which is what caused her to, while still technically being an avian godlike, to lose most of the physical characteristics associated with being an avian godlike. She still retains some of them. She still has some feathers here and there, but by and large, it fell away. So what we can gather from this is that this chime or spark, or however you want to call it, instilled in a person is what makes them godlike and connects them to the appropriate god who gave it to them. Though there are still, of course, a lot of questions surrounding how that actually works. Now, the last thing I want to mention about the godlike before we wrap this up. At some point throughout this video, I'm curious if any of you asked yourself, why would a god want to do this? Why would any of these gods want to put themselves out into the world like that? And you could come up with a variety of answers. But truth be told, we actually get at least a partial answer to this in Pillars of Eternity 2, and it's more than just their own vanity. So in a conversation you can have with the gods towards the end of Pillars of Eternity 2, they very much so are capable of reabsorbing all of their children, as they put it. That is to say, the godlike that is associated with them. Apparently, the gods are able to retake the power they've given to their godlike at any time, which would effectively kill them. It sounds like, it certainly seems to be what is implied from the conversation, but this is mentioned as a way to sustain themselves in times of great need. Almost like a sort of backup plan if things go south. Now, this is a very easily missed bit of conversation, and almost nobody who talks about Pillars of Eternity ever seems to talk about this. The godlikes are very much so connected to their god in more ways than just their appearance, because from this conversation we can gather that at any time the god who gave them their powers can just reabsorb them completely. Which lets me circle back to why Andra has that special marine godlike that is Tekehu. And again, Tekehu is often seen as her special son. She talks to you about Tekehu throughout most of the game and seems to care for him deeply. She does not, obviously, have that exact same feeling about the rest of her moon godlike, which makes me wonder if she made him a separate godlike so she could, potentially absorb all of the moon godlike and maybe leave Tkehu alive as her, again, favored son or something. Now, that part, again, is speculation. I have no proof for that. It's just a theory. But the fact that they can reabsorb their godlike is very much so the case, as we see that conversation happen in-game. Now, that is going to wrap it up for this lore video for the Godlike in Pillars of Eternity. So, thank you guys so much for watching. I truly hope you found it interesting. The Godlike are, in my opinion, one of the more interesting things about the Pillars of Eternity universe. So if you did enjoy it, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.